In the narrow limestone slopes between Dijon and Nuits-Saint-Georges, a viticultural system had evolved over centuries to produce wines of extraordinary complexity. Monks had identified optimal growing conditions. Classification systems had codified quality hierarchies. Traditional methods had proven their worth across generations. The terroir concept itself, the intimate relationship between soil, climate, and human intervention, reached its most refined expression in these fragmented vineyard parcels. Yet this same pursuit of perfection contained the seeds of systematic failure. When market pressures demanded higher alcohol content in the 18th century, producers responded with techniques that technically improved their wines while undermining their fundamental character. When an unknown American insect arrived in the 1860s, the monoculture system that had produced such remarkable results offered no resistance to total devastation. When industrial agriculture promised higher yields and disease control, in the 20th century, the adoption of chemicals that initially solved problems created wines that were technically sound yet qualitatively degraded. This is not a story of incompetence or bad decision-making. Each crisis emerged from rational responses to immediate pressures guided by the same principles that had previously ensured success. Producers followed established procedures, adopted proven technologies, and pursued quality improvements that were both scientifically justified and economically necessary. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. And yet, within decades, observers would describe the results as anemic, coarse, and astringent, the antithesis of everything the Côte de Nuits represented. The transformation of Côte de Nuits from monastic agricultural practice to sophisticated commercial enterprise created a series of latent conditions that would prove critical when the system faced external pressures. These conditions emerged gradually through the 17th and 18th centuries, as traditional quality-focused methods encountered market forces that demanded both consistency and enhancement. What appeared to be natural evolution was actually the systematic embedding of contradictions that would make future crises inevitable. The pivotal moment came during the reign of Louis XIV, when royal medical authority intersected with wine marketing in ways that would reshape production incentives throughout Burgundy. During the reign of King Louis XIV, his personal physician Guy Crescent Fagon recommended that he drink only wines from Nuits-Saint-Georges for their health-giving properties. This recommendation, made on purportedly medical grounds, created an unprecedented market dynamic that would influence production methods far beyond the specific village of Nuits-Saint-Georges. Wine merchants in the Côte de Nuits latched onto this royal association as a great marketing coup over the region's rivals in Champagne and Bordeaux. The commercial implications were immediate and far-reaching. Royal endorsement transformed what had been regional specialties into commodities with international market potential, creating pressures for increased production and standardized quality that traditional methods were not designed to accommodate. The royal physician's influence extended beyond simple marketing. Fagon's medical theories about wine's health benefits specifically emphasized characteristics that could be enhanced through production modification, higher alcohol content, deeper color, and more concentrated flavors. These preferences, backed by royal authority, became market demands that producers felt compelled to meet. The precedent was established that wine characteristics could and should be optimized to meet external requirements, even if this meant departing from traditional terroir expression. The 18th century ushered in a period of tête de cuvée of wines made solely from the best grapes produced in single vineyards. To add to the distinctiveness of these wines, new winemaking techniques such as extended maceration and longer fermentations became popular. This produced dark, tannic vin de garde wines that required extended periods of aging. These techniques represented a fundamental shift in production philosophy, prioritizing intensity and concentration over the subtle expression that had traditionally defined Burgundian excellence. The pursuit of these new wine styles created systematic pressure for enhancement techniques. Extended maceration and longer fermentation periods were scientifically sound methods that could legitimately increase wine concentration and aging potential. However, they also established the principle that traditional methods could be modified to achieve desired characteristics, opening the door to more aggressive interventions when market pressures demanded them. Imitation of this style by producers, using lower quality of grapes, saw producers use various methods of adulteration, such as adding honey to the wine, in order to increase the sugar and, consequently, the alcohol level of the wine. This development revealed how market-driven enhancement could rapidly degrade from legitimate technique to systematic adulteration. Producers working with inferior terroir attempted to replicate the characteristics of superior sites through chemical addition rather than accepting their wine's natural limitations. The institutionalization of enhancement reached its systematic peak with the introduction of chaptalization. Following Jean-Antoine Chaptal's, Napoleon's Minister of the Interior, recommendation to use the method now known as chaptalization to boost alcohol levels, the market was flooded with Burgundy wines from the Côte de Nuits and beyond that were dark, dense, and highly alcoholic. The technique, named after Chaptal himself, involved adding sugar to grape juice before fermentation to increase the final alcohol content of the wine. Chaptalization represented a critical evolution in production thinking. Unlike crude adulteration with honey, this was a scientifically developed technique that could be presented as quality improvement rather than fraud. The sugar addition occurred before fermentation, meaning it was converted to alcohol through natural yeast action rather than being added directly. This technical sophistication allowed producers and regulators to frame chaptalization as legitimate enhancement rather than adulteration. The endorsement by Napoleon's Minister of the Interior provided governmental authority for what was essentially systematic modification of wine character. This official sanction created institutional momentum that made chaptalization appear not just acceptable but progressive. Producers who adopted the technique could claim they were following government-endorsed best practices, while those who resisted could be characterized as backward or unscientific. The rapid adoption of chaptalization revealed how quickly the industry could embrace techniques that modified fundamental wine characteristics when those techniques carried official endorsement and market advantage. After Napoleon's Minister of the Interior, Jean-Antoine Chaptal, encouraged alcohol producers to boost alcohol levels by adding sugar to their wine, Burgundy wines started being produced all over France. These wines were typically dark and made from grapes harvested in the Côte de Nuits and beyond wine tourism. The technique's success led to its widespread adoption not just within the original terroir, but throughout France, fundamentally altering the character of wines labeled as Burgundy. This expansion revealed another critical latent condition: the absence of clear boundaries between authentic terroir expression and enhanced production. The appellation system that would later attempt to address this problem did not yet exist, leaving producers free to adopt any techniques that improved marketability. The traditional understanding that wine character emerged from specific soil-climate cultivation combinations was being replaced by a model where desired characteristics could be achieved through technical intervention. The human factors elements of this transformation were particularly significant. Producers faced a choice between maintaining traditional methods that expressed their specific terroir or adopting enhancement techniques that could make their wines competitive in markets increasingly dominated by concentrated, high-alcohol styles. The rational economic choice was obvious, but it required producers to reframe their understanding of quality itself. Traditional Burgundian quality had been defined by distinctiveness, the ability to express the unique characteristics of specific sites through wines that could not be replicated elsewhere. Enhanced production redefined quality as intensity, deeper color, higher alcohol, and greater concentration became measures of excellence regardless of their relationship to terroir. This shift in quality metrics created systematic pressure for producers to abandon the very characteristics that had made their region distinctive. The training and knowledge transfer systems that had preserved traditional methods for centuries proved inadequate to resist these market pressures. Some of the winemakers producing those hard, dense wines would use some of small segments of white grapes grown in the Côte de Nuits as a softening blend in a manner similar to how white grapes were historically used in Chianti. Even techniques borrowed from other regions were being adapted to achieve the desired style characteristics, demonstrating how far producers were willing to depart from local traditions when market forces demanded it. The procedural changes introduced during this period established precedents that would prove critical during future crises. Enhancement techniques became normalized as quality improvement rather than deviation from tradition. Chemical intervention was reframed as scientific progress rather than adulteration. Market responsiveness was prioritized over terroir preservation. These procedural biases would shape decision-making during subsequent challenges, making certain choices appear logical and beneficial when they actually compromise the system's fundamental integrity. The organizational structures that emerged to support enhanced production created institutional momentum that would be difficult to reverse. Producers invested in equipment and knowledge specific to concentration techniques. Distributors developed marketing strategies emphasizing intensity and alcohol content. Consumers developed preferences for wines that express power rather than subtlety. Each element of the commercial chain became aligned with enhancement rather than traditional expression. Perhaps most significantly, the success of enhancement techniques in achieving market objectives validated the underlying assumption that wine characteristics could be optimized through human intervention. This validation would prove crucial during future crises, making technical solutions appear preferable to adaptive strategies that might require accepting reduced commercial competitiveness. The interface between traditional knowledge and commercial requirements had been permanently altered. What had once been a direct relationship between terroir and wine character was now mediated by enhancement techniques that could modify expression to meet market demands. This mediation introduced systematic uncertainty about which characteristics reflected authentic terroir and which resulted from production manipulation. By the end of the 18th century, the Côte de Nuits wine industry had embedded within its production culture a set of assumptions and practices that would prove critical during future challenges. Enhancement was accepted as legitimate quality improvement. Chemical intervention was normalized as scientific progress. Market responsiveness was prioritized over traditional expression. These latent conditions created a production culture that would readily embrace technical solutions to external threats, often without fully understanding their long-term consequences for terroir authenticity. The systematic devastation of the Côte de Nuits began with what appeared to be a routine horticultural experiment in the early 1860s. French vignerons, facing ongoing challenges with powdery mildew that had plagued European vineyards throughout the 1850s, sought solutions through the importation of American vine species that appeared naturally resistant to fungal diseases. This seemingly logical response to an immediate agricultural problem introduced a threat that would expose the fundamental vulnerability of a viticultural system optimized for excellence under stable conditions. The decision to import American vines reflected the same scientific rationality that had driven earlier enhancement techniques. European viticulture was experiencing widespread problems with oidium, a powdery mildew that had devastated vineyards across the continent. American vine species, having evolved in environments where such fungal pressures were common, displayed natural resistance that European varieties lacked. The importation appeared to represent exactly the kind of scientific progress that had previously improved wine quality and production reliability. The protocols governing these imports embodied the confidence of a system that had successfully adapted to previous challenges. Vine material was selected based on its resistance to known problems and its potential for improving European viticulture through hybridization or grafting experiments. The focus remained entirely on the intended benefits, disease resistance, vigor, and potential quality improvements. No systematic consideration was given to the possibility that these imports might introduce entirely new categories of threat. This oversight reflected a critical design assumption embedded within European viticultural thinking, that biological threats were discrete and manageable problems that could be addressed through targeted interventions. The success of various chemical treatments against fungal diseases had reinforced this assumption, creating confidence that unknown problems could be solved through the same systematic approach that had previously proven effective. The first documented appearance of what would later be identified as phylloxera occurred in 1863 near Avignon, in vineyards that had received American vine materials. Initially, the symptoms were attributed to familiar causes, poor drainage, soil exhaustion, or normal vine aging. The affected vines showed characteristic signs of decline, yellowing leaves, reduced vigor, and eventual death that were consistent with various known problems. Nothing in the visible symptoms suggested the presence of an entirely new category of threat. This diagnostic confusion was not merely an oversight but rather a logical response to the information available at the time. European viticulture had developed sophisticated understanding of soil-related vine problems, fungal diseases, and environmental stresses. The systematic approach to vineyard management emphasized identifying problems through visible symptoms and applying targeted solutions based on established cause and effect relationships. When vines began dying in patterns that resembled known problems, the logical response was to apply established diagnostic frameworks. The underground nature of phylloxera's attack made it particularly difficult to identify through conventional observation methods. While the insect was feeding on root systems and introducing toxins that would eventually kill the vines, the initial symptoms manifested primarily in above-ground decline that could easily be attributed to other causes. The time lag between initial infestation and visible symptoms meant that by the time problems became apparent, the pest had already established itself throughout the affected vineyard areas. More critically, the dispersal mechanism that made phylloxera so devastating was directly linked to the characteristics that made Côte de Nuits viticulture excellent. The high-density plantings that maximized quality potential from limited optimal sites also created ideal conditions for pest transmission. Root systems in closely planted vineyards often interconnected, creating pathways for underground movement that were invisible to surface observation. The very precision that allowed producers to extract maximum quality from specific terroir also maximized the efficiency of pest transmission once introduction occurred. The geographic pattern of initial spread followed the concentrations of highest quality vineyards with devastating logic. The most intensively planted areas, representing the greatest investment in both economic and cultural terms, proved most vulnerable to systematic invasion. The limestone and marl soils that provided optimal drainage and mineral composition for vine quality also offered favorable conditions for phylloxera survival and reproduction. The correlation between vineyard quality and vulnerability meant that the pest attacked precisely those areas where traditional knowledge and economic investment were most concentrated. The detection timeline revealed how the system's strength in producing exceptional wines under normal conditions became its greatest weakness when facing unprecedented threats. French viticulture had developed extraordinary sophistication in identifying and responding to familiar problems, but this expertise proved inadequate when confronted with an entirely unknown pest that attacked in ways that previous experience had not prepared vintners to recognize. Scientific investigation initially focused on soil chemistry and environmental factors, reflecting the assumption that vine decline must result from correctable conditions rather than biological invasion. Soil analysis, drainage assessment, and nutritional evaluation were the logical first steps based on established diagnostic procedures. These investigations consumed valuable time, while the actual cause continued its systematic expansion throughout the region's most important vineyards. The delayed recognition of phylloxera's presence was not a failure of scientific method, but rather a consequence of applying established frameworks to a fundamentally new category of problem. When investigators eventually identified the actual cause, they discovered that their previous success in managing familiar threats had created systematic blindness to unfamiliar ones. The expertise that made the system excellent under normal conditions provided no preparation for threats that operated outside established parameters. The moment of recognition represented a fundamental shift in understanding about the nature of viticultural vulnerability. What had appeared to be a stable relationship between soil, climate, and cultivation was revealed to be contingent on biological assumptions that had never been explicitly examined. European viticulture was not inherently superior to other systems. It had simply evolved in isolation from threats that were common in other viticultural environments. The realization that vine decline was caused by an introduced pest rather than manageable environmental conditions transformed the entire framework for understanding vineyard problems. Traditional approaches assumed that careful observation and targeted intervention could address any threats that emerged. The discovery that a microscopic insect could systematically destroy entire vineyard systems, regardless of soil quality, cultivation method, or traditional expertise, represented a fundamental challenge to the confidence that had driven previous innovations. The scope of the threat became apparent as systematic surveys revealed the extent of infestation throughout the region. Areas that had appeared healthy were found to harbor early-stage infestations that would inevitably progress to complete vine death. The time lag between initial invasion and visible symptoms meant that the problem was far more extensive than surface observation had suggested. Traditional assessment methods, which had proven reliable for familiar problems, were inadequate for understanding the true scope of a threat that operated primarily underground. The economic implications were immediately apparent to producers who had invested heavily in high-density plantings of quality varieties. Unlike fungal diseases, which could potentially be managed through chemical treatment while preserving existing vines, phylloxera infestation appeared to require complete vineyard replanting. This meant not only the loss of current production, but also the destruction of vine systems that had taken decades to establish and whose replacement would require years of non-productive investment. The systematic nature of the threat eliminated the possibility of selective response that had proven effective with previous challenges. Producers could not simply treat affected areas while maintaining production in healthy sections, because the pest's dispersal patterns meant that apparent health was likely temporary. The binary choice between accepting total loss and attempting complete replanting forced decisions that traditional vineyard management had never required. The social disruption accompanying vine loss revealed how thoroughly the region's economic and cultural identity had become dependent on viticultural success. Vineyard workers, whose families had developed specialized knowledge over generations, found their expertise suddenly irrelevant to the crisis at hand. The systematic replacement of traditional knowledge with emergency responses disrupted social structures that had provided stability and continuity for centuries. The divergence between system design and system reality became complete when producers recognized that their sophisticated understanding of terroir and traditional methods provided no guidance for addressing the crisis. Everything that had made the Côte de Nuits exceptional, its focus on specific sites, its intensive cultivation methods, its emphasis on traditional knowledge, proved either irrelevant or counterproductive when dealing with an unprecedented biological threat. This recognition forced a fundamental reassessment of assumptions that had guided viticultural development for centuries. The belief that traditional knowledge could address any challenges that emerged was replaced by uncertainty about which established practices remained valid and which had become obsolete. The confidence that had driven previous innovations gave way to systematic doubt about the relationship between established methods and successful outcomes. The irreversible nature of the Côte de Nuits crisis became apparent only when scientific investigation revealed the specific biological mechanisms through which phylloxera attacked European vine systems. What had initially appeared to be a manageable agricultural problem proved to be a fundamental incompatibility between evolved biological systems that made traditional recovery methods impossible. The physics of pest invasion, vine response, and ecosystem collapse demonstrated that the region's centuries of optimization had created precisely the conditions that would ensure systematic failure when confronted with this particular threat. The biological foundation of phylloxera's effectiveness lay in an evolutionary arms race that had never included European vine species. In North America, native vine species had developed over millennia alongside phylloxera populations, creating complex biological relationships involving resistance mechanisms, feeding behaviors, and population controls that maintained ecological balance. American vines possessed thick-skinned root systems with cellular structures that could withstand phylloxera feeding, and chemical compounds that limited pest reproduction. These evolutionary adaptations represented millions of years of coevolution between predator and host. European vine species, having evolved in geographic isolation from phylloxera, possessed none of these defensive mechanisms. The cellular structure of European vine roots was optimized for nutrient absorption and water uptake in Mediterranean climates, with thin-walled cells that maximize surface area for mineral exchange. This adaptation, which contributed directly to the distinctive mineral expression that made Burgundian wines exceptional, also made European roots extraordinarily vulnerable to phylloxera attack. The feeding mechanism that made Phylloxera so destructive to European vines involved a sophisticated biological process that had evolved specifically to exploit thin-walled root systems. The insect's feeding apparatus included both a feeding tube for nutrient extraction and a separate venom canal for injecting digestive compounds. When Phylloxera fed on American vines, the host plant's cellular defenses neutralized these compounds before significant damage occurred. When applied to European vine roots, the same compounds cause immediate cellular breakdown and systemic poisoning that would eventually kill the entire plant. The geographic expansion of Phylloxera throughout the Côte de Nuits followed predictable biological patterns that were invisible to contemporary observers, but devastating in their efficiency. Female Phylloxera possessed both winged and wingless forms, allowing for both local spread through root contact and long-distance dispersal through flight. The wingless forms were responsible for the systematic expansion that followed root systems and vineyard boundaries, while winged forms enabled the pest to establish new colonies in previously uninfested areas. The population dynamics that drove this expansion were particularly suited to the intensive cultivation methods that characterized quality Burgundian viticulture. Phylloxera reproduction rates increased exponentially under optimal conditions, abundant food sources, suitable soil temperatures, and minimal natural predators. The high-density plantings that maximized terroir expression also maximized pest food availability, creating population explosions that could overwhelm entire vineyard systems within a single growing season. The timeline of vine death followed biological processes that were both predictable and irreversible once initiated. Initial Phylloxera feeding caused localized root damage that reduced the vine's ability to absorb water and nutrients. As feeding continued, the injected compounds spread through the root system, causing systematic cellular breakdown that could not be reversed through any available treatment methods. The visible symptoms of vine decline appeared only after root damage had become extensive enough to affect above-ground growth, by which point recovery was impossible. The soil chemistry changes accompanying widespread vine death created secondary effects that compounded the crisis. Decomposing root systems altered pH levels and nutrient availability in ways that made replanting difficult even after pest populations had been reduced. The complex soil microbiome that supported healthy vine growth was disrupted by the combination of extensive root death and chemical compounds introduced through Phylloxera feeding. These changes meant that even successful pest control would not restore the soil conditions that had originally made specific sites suitable for quality viticulture. The economic timeline of the crisis reflected the biological reality that pest-induced vine death was both inevitable and complete. Unlike fungal diseases, which might damage specific vine components while leaving the plant capable of recovery, Phylloxera feeding systematically destroyed the root systems that were essential for vine survival. Producers faced the choice between accepting total loss or investing in complete replanting with no guarantee that replacement vines would survive subsequent infestations. The mass balance of pest reproduction versus vine survival revealed why traditional agricultural responses proved inadequate. A single Phylloxera female could produce hundreds of offspring during a single season, with each subsequent generation capable of similar reproduction rates. The exponential growth of pest populations meant that even significant mortality from environmental factors or control attempts could be quickly compensated by survivor reproduction. Meanwhile, vine replacement required years of non-productive investment before new plants could establish sufficient root systems to begin producing marketable crops. The chemical control methods that were initially attempted demonstrated both the sophistication of contemporary agricultural science and its limitations when confronting unprecedented biological challenges. Carbon disulfide injection into soil could effectively kill Phylloxera populations within the treated area, but the technique required precise application methods, was extremely expensive, and posed significant health risks to workers. More critically, the treatment had to be repeated regularly because reinfestations from untreated areas would quickly re-establish pest populations. The biological reality underlying these control efforts was that European viticulture was attempting to eliminate a pest that had evolved specifically to exploit European vine biology. The target was not a temporary invader that could be expelled through intensive effort, but rather a biological system that had found optimal conditions for survival and reproduction. The pest's evolutionary advantage meant that control efforts required permanent, systematic intervention rather than temporary treatments that would restore natural balance. The discovery that American vine species possess natural resistance to phylloxera provided the foundation for what would eventually become the industry's salvation. But it also revealed the extent to which the crisis represented fundamental biological incompatibility rather than manageable agricultural challenge. Grafting European vine varieties onto American rootstock could preserve the characteristics that made Burgundian wines distinctive, while providing the biological defenses necessary for vine survival. However, this solution required abandoning the assumption that authentic terroir expression emerged from direct contact between European vines and Burgundian soil. The grafting process itself introduced biological complexities that would permanently alter the relationship between vine and terroir. The rootstock, being American in origin, possessed different mineral uptake patterns, water absorption rates, and soil interaction mechanisms than European roots. These differences meant that grafted vines, while capable of survival, would necessarily express terroir characteristics differently than the ungrafted vines that had established the region's reputation for distinctive wine character. The systematic nature of required changes became apparent as successful phylloxera management demanded not just individual vine replacement but complete ecosystem modification. Traditional cultivation methods, planting densities, and soil management techniques all required adjustment to accommodate the biological realities of grafted vine systems. The precision that had allowed producers to maximize quality expression from specific sites had to be fundamentally reconsidered in light of new biological constraints. The temporal aspects of recovery revealed why the crisis represented genuine system failure rather than temporary disruption. Vine establishment required minimum 3 to 5 years before production could begin, with another 5 to 10 years needed before wine quality would reach the levels that had established market reputation. This meant that even successful adaptation strategies required decade-long investments with uncertain outcomes, during which traditional knowledge bases would inevitably be disrupted and potentially lost. The selection pressures accompanying wholesale replanting necessarily altered the genetic composition of vineyard systems throughout the region. Traditional European vine varieties that had proven most susceptible to phylloxera damage were replaced with grafted versions that, while sharing some characteristics with their predecessors, represented fundamentally different biological entities. The cumulative effect was systematic genetic modification of the region's vineyard ecosystem, driven by survival necessity rather than quality optimization. The recognition that biological salvation required biological compromise forced a fundamental reassessment of what constituted authentic terroir expression. The assumption that wine character emerged from direct interaction between specific soil types and traditional vine varieties was replaced by understanding that survival required mediated relationships involving non-native biological components. This shift from direct to mediated terroir interaction would prove to have lasting implications for wine character and regional identity. The epidemiological patterns that drove phylloxera expansion throughout Europe demonstrated that the Côte de Nuits crisis was not an isolated regional problem, but rather a manifestation of systematic vulnerability that characterized all European viticulture. The pest's expansion followed trade routes, vineyard distributions, and climatic patterns in ways that made containment impossible once initial establishment had occurred. The biological momentum of the crisis was continental in scope and generational in duration. The ecosystem-level changes accompanying widespread vine death and systematic replanting eliminated many of the environmental relationships that had contributed to regional wine character. Traditional vineyard biodiversity, soil microorganism populations, and pest-predator balances were disrupted by the combination of extensive plant death and intensive intervention efforts required for recovery. The biological foundation that had supported centuries of quality wine production was fundamentally altered in ways that could not be fully reversed even after successful pest management. The systematic response to phylloxera devastation required abandoning fundamental assumptions about the relationship between terroir and wine character that had guided Burgundian viticulture for centuries. While the solutions that emerged successfully preserved the industry's productive capacity, they introduced dependencies and alterations that created entirely new categories of vulnerability. The recovery process revealed that biological salvation necessarily involved biological compromise, establishing patterns of technological dependence that would shape the region's development for generations. The adoption of American rootstock grafting as the primary solution to phylloxera represented both remarkable scientific innovation and fundamental departure from traditional terroir principles. French viticulturists, working with limited understanding of long-term implications, embraced grafting technology that could preserve European vine varieties while providing the biological defenses necessary for survival. The technique appeared to offer an ideal compromise, maintaining the genetic material that produced distinctive wine character while adding the resistance mechanisms needed to prevent systematic pest destruction. The implementation of grafting protocols required developing entirely new categories of viticultural expertise. Traditional vignerons, whose knowledge had been passed down through generations of direct vine cultivation, suddenly needed to master complex biological techniques involving rootstock selection, grafting procedures, and compatibility management. The systematic nature of replanting meant that entire vineyard workforces required retraining in methods that had no precedent in European viticultural history. The rootstock selection process introduced decision-making complexities that had never existed in traditional viticulture. Different American vine species offered varying combinations of pest resistance, soil adaptation, and vigor characteristics. The choice of rootstock would permanently influence vine behavior, soil interaction patterns, and ultimately wine character in ways that could not be easily reversed once grafting was complete. Producers faced technical decisions about fundamental biological relationships without adequate knowledge of long-term consequences. The most widely adopted rootstock varieties represented compromises between phylloxera resistance and compatibility with European growing conditions. Species like Vitis riparia and Vitis rupestris offered proven pest resistance but possessed growth characteristics and soil preferences that differed significantly from traditional European vine behavior. The biological interfaces created through grafting necessarily modified the relationship between vine and terroir in ways that would affect wine character indefinitely. The grafting process itself introduced systematic quality variability that had been minimal in traditional vine cultivation. The success of individual graft unions depended on precise technique, environmental conditions during healing, and biological compatibility between scion and rootstock. Even skilled practitioners experienced failure rates that meant vineyard establishment required overplanting and subsequent selection, adding costs and uncertainty that traditional methods had not involved. The temporal requirements of grafted vine establishment extended the recovery timeline far beyond what had been anticipated when grafting was first adopted as a solution. While ungrafted vines could begin producing marketable crops within 3 to 4 years of planting, grafted systems often required 5 to 7 years to achieve comparable productivity. This extended non-productive period strained the economic resources of producers who had already suffered total loss during the initial phylloxera devastation. The soil interaction patterns of American rootstock created secondary effects that became apparent only after widespread implementation. American vine species had evolved different root morphology and nutrient uptake mechanisms than European varieties, leading to altered soil chemistry over time. The deep, vigorous root systems of American species could extract nutrients from soil depths that European vines had not accessed, potentially depleting mineral resources that had contributed to traditional terroir expression. The biological vigor of American rootstock introduced systematic challenges in managing vine growth and fruit production. Most American species possess greater vegetative vigor than European varieties, leading to excessive canopy growth that could shade fruit and reduce concentration. Producers discovered that traditional pruning and training methods were inadequate for managing grafted vines, requiring development of new cultivation techniques that had no precedent in regional viticultural tradition. The chemical control methods that were employed alongside grafting introduced the first systematic dependence on industrial inputs in Burgundian viticulture. Carbon disulfide soil treatments, while effective against phylloxera, required specialized equipment, technical expertise, and ongoing expense that traditional methods had not involved. The success of chemical control validated the principle that external inputs could solve biological problems, establishing precedents for technological dependence that would expand dramatically in subsequent decades. The concurrent development of chemical treatments for fungal diseases created additional dependencies that appeared beneficial in the short term but fundamentally altered the biological environment of vineyard ecosystems. Copper sulfate applications, initially developed for treating downy mildew, proved effective against multiple fungal pathogens that had historically caused variable crop losses. The predictability offered by chemical disease control encouraged producers to invest in higher density plantings and more intensive cultivation methods. The systematic adoption of chemical inputs created feedback loops that made continuing technological dependence increasingly necessary. As natural pest predator populations declined due to chemical treatments, biological control mechanisms that had historically managed pest pressures became less effective. Producers found that discontinuing chemical applications often resulted in pest problems that were more severe than those experienced before chemical use began, effectively locking them into ongoing technological dependence. The economic incentives accompanying chemical disease control encouraged production intensification that would have been impossible under traditional methods. Reliable fungal disease prevention allowed producers to plant vines in marginal sites that had previously been considered too risky due to disease pressure. The expansion of cultivated area into these marginal sites increased total production, but often at the expense of average quality, beginning a shift toward quantity optimization that contradicted traditional terroir principles. The soil fertility management that accompanied replanting efforts introduced systematic mineral supplementation that had been minimal in traditional viticulture. The extensive soil disruption caused by vineyard replanting, combined with the changed nutrient uptake patterns of American rootstock, created perceived needs for fertilizer applications that would maintain vine nutrition. While initial fertilizer use appeared conservative and scientifically justified, it established infrastructure and expertise for more intensive chemical inputs. The labor specialization required for managing grafted vines and chemical applications created systematic dependencies on technical expertise that differed fundamentally from traditional viticultural knowledge. Workers needed training in grafting techniques, chemical application procedures, and equipment maintenance that had no relationship to the empirical observations and traditional practices that had previously defined vineyard expertise. The professionalization of viticulture reduced the role of intuitive understanding and local knowledge that had been central to traditional quality production. The standardization pressures accompanying systematic replanting encouraged adoption of uniform practices that contradicted the site-specific variations that had characterized traditional terroir expression. Grafting techniques, chemical application schedules, and vine training methods were increasingly standardized to achieve reliable results across diverse vineyard sites. This standardization improved technical success rates, but reduced the micro-variations in vineyard management that had contributed to distinctive site character. The market responses to grafted vine production revealed consumer uncertainty about wine authenticity that had not existed during the pre-phylloxera period. Wines produced from grafted vines, while often technically superior to their predecessors in terms of consistency and defect-free character, sometimes lacked the distinctive mineral expression and aging complexity that had established the region's reputation. The biological mediation introduced by American rootstock created subtle but persistent changes in wine character that were difficult to explain or market. The quality assessment protocols that developed during the recovery period necessarily emphasized characteristics that could be reliably achieved through technological intervention, rather than those that emerged from traditional terroir expression. Color intensity, alcohol content, and freedom from obvious defects became primary quality indicators because these characteristics could be consistently produced through grafting and chemical management. The subtle terroir expressions that had defined pre-phylloxera quality were more difficult to achieve reliably and therefore became secondary considerations. The regional identity reconstruction that accompanied systematic replanting required redefining what constituted authentic Burgundian wine character. Traditional definitions based on direct soil-vine relationships were replaced by more flexible concepts that could accommodate the biological realities of grafted production. This redefinition necessarily involved compromise between historical identity and current technical requirements, establishing patterns of adaptation that would be repeated during subsequent technological transitions. The knowledge transfer disruptions caused by wholesale transition to grafted viticulture eliminated much of the empirical wisdom that had been accumulated over centuries of traditional practice. Older vignerons, whose expertise had been developed through direct experience with ungrafted vines, found their knowledge less relevant to grafted vine management. Younger workers learned technical procedures for managing grafted systems, but lacked the deep understanding of vine-soil relationships that had characterized traditional expertise. The biological monitoring systems that developed to assess grafted vine performance introduced systematic data collection that had been informal in traditional viticulture. Producers began tracking vine growth rates, fruit composition, and soil chemistry with precision that had not been necessary when vine behavior was more predictable. This increased monitoring reflected both the reduced intuitive understanding of grafted vine behavior and the greater variability introduced by technological mediation. The success of technological solutions to biological problems validated approaches to vineyard management that would prove critical during subsequent challenges. The demonstration that external inputs and biological modification could preserve production while maintaining acceptable quality established confidence in technological adaptation that would influence responses to later environmental and economic pressures. The precedent of successful biological compromise encouraged similar technological dependencies when new challenges emerged. The systematic nature of recovery efforts necessarily altered the social and economic structures that had characterized traditional Burgundian viticulture. Small family producers, who had managed traditional vines through generational knowledge, often lacked the capital and technical expertise required for systematic replanting with grafted vines. The concentration of successful recovery efforts among larger producers with access to capital and technical resources began a consolidation process that would continue throughout the following century. The long-term consequences of the Côte de Nuits recovery revealed a fundamental transformation in the relationship between terroir, technology, and quality that extended far beyond the immediate solutions to phylloxera devastation. Forensic examination of soil composition, vine performance, and wine character in the decades following systematic replanting demonstrated that each technological intervention had created lasting dependencies and alterations that would define modern Burgundian viticulture. The evidence accumulated over generations showed that the pursuit of production security had necessarily involved sacrificing the authentic terroir expression that had originally established the region's reputation. The soil analysis conducted in the mid-20th century revealed systematic changes in mineral composition and biological activity that traced directly to the technological interventions employed during phylloxera recovery. Comparative studies of vineyard sites that had been replanted with grafted vines versus the rare parcels that had somehow avoided infestation showed measurable differences in soil chemistry, microbial populations, and nutrient cycling patterns. The American rootstock systems had altered fundamental soil relationships in ways that persisted decades after initial planting. The mineral uptake patterns documented through systematic vine analysis demonstrated that grafted systems extracted nutrients differently than traditional European vines had done. The deeper, more vigorous root systems of American species accessed soil layers that had historically remained undisturbed, altering the mineral profiles available to the European scions grafted above. These changes were subtle but persistent, affecting wine character in ways that were difficult to quantify but increasingly apparent to experienced tasters familiar with pre-phylloxera wines. The chemical residue analysis that became possible with advancing analytical techniques revealed the cumulative effects of decades of chemical disease control that had begun during the recovery period. Copper accumulation in vineyard soils, resulting from repeated applications of copper sulfate fungicides, had reached levels that affected soil microbial populations and vine nutrition. The supposedly temporary chemical interventions had created permanent alterations in vineyard ecosystems that continued to influence vine behavior long after their initial application. The comparative wine analysis conducted by researchers attempting to understand quality changes provided the most compelling evidence of systematic alteration in regional wine character. Wines produced from the few surviving ungrafted vines, when compared with contemporary production from grafted systems, displayed consistent differences in mineral expression, aging complexity, and site-specific character. The grafted wines, while often technically superior in terms of consistency and defect-free production, lacked certain subtle characteristics that had defined pre-phylloxera Burgundian quality. The documentation of these quality changes forced a fundamental reassessment of what constituted authentic terroir expression in post-phylloxera viticulture. The wines being produced, while clearly superior to those from devastated vineyards, represented a different relationship between soil and vine than had existed historically. The question of whether this represented evolution or degradation of terroir became central to ongoing debates about authenticity and quality in Burgundian wine production. The economic analysis of recovery costs revealed the systematic financial pressures that had driven many of the technological compromises made during the crisis. The capital requirements for systematic replanting with grafted vines, combined with extended periods of non-production, had forced many traditional family producers to seek external financing or sell their holdings to larger operations with sufficient resources. This consolidation had altered the social structure of Burgundian viticulture in ways that influenced both production methods and quality priorities. The labor specialization that had accompanied technological adoption created systematic dependencies that made returning to traditional methods increasingly difficult. Workers trained in chemical application, grafting techniques, and equipment maintenance possessed skills that were valuable in the technological viticulture that had emerged from the crisis, but had limited relevance to traditional methods. The institutional knowledge required for managing complex technological systems replaced the empirical understanding of natural processes that had characterized pre-crisis viticulture. The regulatory responses that emerged in the early 20th century represented attempts to preserve authenticity within the technological constraints that had become necessary for production survival. The development of the Appellation d'origine contrôlée system reflected recognition that traditional terroir relationships had been fundamentally altered and that legal frameworks were needed to define what constituted authentic regional production under new technological conditions. The appellation regulations themselves embodied the compromises that had characterized the entire recovery process. While the rules attempted to preserve traditional grape varieties, cultivation methods, and regional identity, they necessarily accommodated the technological dependencies that had become essential for viable production. Grafted vines were accepted as authentic, chemical treatments were permitted as necessary, and production methods were standardized in ways that would have been foreign to traditional viticulture. The geographical expansion of technological dependencies revealed that the changes initiated during phylloxera recovery had established patterns that would influence responses to all subsequent challenges. When new pests, diseases, or environmental pressures emerged, the precedent of technological solution had been established. Chemical control, biological modification, and systematic intervention became the default responses to viticultural problems, regardless of whether traditional methods might have offered viable alternatives. The documentation of continued quality evolution throughout the 20th century showed that the technological path initiated during phylloxera recovery had created ongoing pressures for further modification. Each generation of vignerons faced new challenges that could be addressed through additional technological interventions, creating systematic drift away from traditional methods that had originally defined regional character. The cumulative effect was gradual but persistent alteration of wine character that could not be easily reversed. The comparative analysis of regions that had experienced different levels of technological intervention provided evidence that the degree of technological dependence was directly related to the extent of authentic terroir preservation. areas that had maintained traditional methods to the greatest extent possible, continued to produce wines with characteristics that were recognizably related to historical regional character, while heavily technological regions showed systematic divergence from traditional quality profiles. The international market responses to these quality changes revealed consumer uncertainty about authenticity that reflected genuine alterations in wine character. Traditional Burgundy enthusiasts, particularly those familiar with pre-phylloxera wines, could detect consistent differences in mineral expression, aging behavior, and site-specific character that marked the transition to technological production. These differences were subtle, but persistent enough to influence market perceptions and pricing patterns. The research conducted on vine genetics revealed that even the European Scion varieties had undergone systematic changes during the process of adaptation to grafted production. Selection pressures during replanting had favored genetic variants that performed well in grafted systems, gradually altering the genetic composition of supposedly traditional varieties. The cumulative effect was genetic drift that further separated modern production from its historical antecedents. The soil microbiology studies that became possible with advancing scientific techniques demonstrated that the biological foundation supporting vine growth had been fundamentally altered by decades of technological intervention. The complex relationships between soil organisms, root systems, and nutrient cycling that had characterized traditional vineyard ecosystems had been simplified through chemical management and biological modification in ways that reduced complexity and resilience. The climate vulnerability analysis conducted in response to changing environmental conditions revealed that the technological systems developed during phylloxera recovery had created new categories of fragility. The standardized practices, uniform rootstock, and chemical dependencies that had enabled systematic recovery also reduced the diversity and adaptability that would be necessary for responding to climate change and other emerging challenges. The economic sustainability assessments showed that the technological dependencies initiated during crisis response had created ongoing cost structures that made traditional methods economically non-viable for most producers. The infrastructure, expertise, and material inputs required for technological production represented fixed costs that had to be amortized across production volumes, encouraging further intensification and standardization. The cultural impact documentation revealed that the transformation of viticultural methods had necessarily altered the social relationships and traditional knowledge systems that had characterized Burgundian wine culture. The technical expertise required for managing technological systems replaced the empirical wisdom that had been transmitted through generations, disrupting cultural continuity in ways that extended beyond production methods to influence regional identity. The lesson synthesis that emerged from comprehensive analysis of the recovery period demonstrated that the pursuit of production security through technological intervention had necessarily involved systematic compromise of the authentic terroir relationships that had originally defined regional excellence. Each technological solution had preserved immediate functionality while creating dependencies and alterations that made returning to traditional methods increasingly difficult. The systemic vulnerability that characterized post-recovery viticulture reflected the fundamental tension between optimization and resilience that had driven the original crisis. The technological systems that had enabled survival under specific threat conditions created new vulnerabilities to different categories of challenge, establishing patterns of technological dependence that would shape responses to all future pressures. The recognition that authentic terroir expression and production security represented competing rather than complementary objectives forced acknowledgement that the recovery process had necessarily involved choosing technological survival over traditional authenticity. This choice, while understandable given the alternatives available at the time, had established precedents for technological solutions that would influence Burgundian viticulture indefinitely. The ultimate forensic conclusion was that the Côte de Nuits had successfully preserved its productive capacity and market position through systematic sacrifice of the traditional terroir relationships that had originally established its reputation. The wines being produced were demonstrably different from their historical antecedents, representing technological adaptations to biological and economic pressures rather than authentic expressions of unmediated terroir. The region's survival had required fundamental transformation of its essential character.